of the African Child on June 16. The event held on the continent and around the world. Back here, we have a few considerations to make about the day and how the rights of the African child is so important. My name is Teve Agabi on the anchor. And our guest is Dr. Elijah Bano of the History Department, Benue State University, Makurdi. Doc, welcome to the anchor.
Thank you. And thank you for having me.
So, how does it feel coming to our studio?
Yeah, I've been here before, and
Okay.
It's always nice being in your studio.
Okay.
And I hope we have a good program.
Yeah, there's every need to know, especially as concerns the African child.
Okay, yeah. Like you said, my name is Elijah Bano. Yeah, I'm a lecturer in the Department of History at the Benue State University. The Day of African Child, DAC as it is called, was declared in 1991
Okay.
by the Assembly of African Heads of States and Governments. It was to commemorate the uprisings of the children in Soweto who stood up for their rights in South Africa. So it was to remember and appreciate them, remember them for standing up for their rights.
Okay.
And that event actually happened on the 16th of June in 1976. So the Assembly of African Heads of States and Governments felt every June 16th should be used to remember the children. And it was in 1991. And since then, African Union has been marking June 16th as the Day of African Child.
Okay. All right. So, if I heard you right, this event was supposed to honor the memories of those children, those students who were massacred in Soweto, South Africa, right?
Yes.
That was
1976.
1976.
Yeah.
You said they were protesting some kind of.
Yeah, they were asking for their rights, and they were being suppressed.
Okay.
You know, as students. So.
All right. Protesting against education injustice and inadequacies or inequality, right?
Yeah.
So, to the best of your understanding, how is this helping the African child today?
You know, most of these memorial days are marked to give people that sense of that nostalgic sense of importance of events in the past, like so that they don't forget about what happened in the past and the importance of that, because when you learn about past events, is for the present and to also fashion the future. So if you look at the level of education in Africa generally, you will appreciate that this day helps Africans to remember that the African child has rights to education. So you will appreciate the level of the education that they have at present, whether it should be appreciated or it should not be appreciated, whether we are on the right path or we're not on the right path. For instance, it is estimated that in 2050, the African children will mark 1 billion in population. So if you look at their rights to education, you will see if they are getting the kind of education they should get or not. And by 2050, as you are projecting that there will be 1 billion children, if they are all out of school, you will look at the meaning of that to African society. So marking this day now brings to light if we are making progress in educating the African child or not. You will also appreciate the fact that, by UNESCO percentages, statistics, it is agreed that the African child of 6 to 11 years, about 20% of African children of 6 to 11 years are out of school. And then those of between 12 to 14 years, about 30% of the population is out of school. And about 15 to 17 years, about 60% of that population is out of school. So if we are marking this day, we are marking it to look at how we can be able to, reduce the level of children in Africa that are out of school, and also do away with out of school children if we are trying to look at this event.
Okay, but why has it taken this long? I've just taken a look at the theme for the year 2024 celebration, education for children in Africa. The time is now. Why now? All this why? Why hasn't it happened before?
Yeah,
what has been the problem?
Yeah, the idea is this day, like in 2014, the Day of African Child's theme was also on education.
Okay.
So, and this year's African Union's theme generally is on education. So it coincides with the 10th anniversary of when last the theme of Day of African Child was on education. So the time is now, is just to remind us that we should be able to look at the proposals, the recommendations that were made 10 years ago. And if those proposals and recommendations have been implemented, fine. If they have not been implemented, what do we do? So the time to look at those recommendations and those proposals that were made in 2014, about 10 years ago, the time is now to reflect on them.
Okay. All right. I thought it was just to tell us that it's now that it's the time to do that. If not, I would have queried why it has taken this long for this to happen. Well, you also discovered that 98 million children aged 6 to 8 or 6 to 18 are not in school, more than 40%.
Yeah.
And most of them live in sub-Saharan Africa, Nigeria inclusive. Yeah. Now that the time is now, what do you think Nigeria should do? What should be our focus so that we don't resort in just singing the normal song we've been singing?
Yeah, thank you very much. If we look at you have called the percentages. You've given us statistics of out of school children, and I also gave us that in relation to the ages. But if we are looking at what should be done, then we should look at why we have gotten into such situation. You will recall that the out of school children in Africa is caused by some certain factors. For instance, you will look at issues of gender-based discrimination. That is where you talk about hygiene and sanitary for the girl child. Most of them don't have access to sanitary pads, and they must have gotten enrolled in school, but in the process, that's why you will see that from the beginning of age 6 to 11, you have just 20% out of school. Then from 12 to 14, then you have 30%. Then from 15 to 17, you have 60%. It means that the higher you go, the more they begin to drop out of school. And partly, most of them would have been women, would have been the girl child, because like I mentioned, the issue of even hygiene. We all know we are living in an environment that there is so much poverty. To even buy sanitary pads for these little girl children is a problem. In fact, there was one campaign that I saw that lasted for some time that um, female uh, gender were campaigning that, okay, for condoms to be shared freely, then sanitary pads should be shared freely, because for condom you have a choice, but for sanitary pads you don't have a choice because it's natural to them. So you see that those children, those female children that of menstruation period, if they don't have access to sanitary pads, then maybe it is during time of exams in school, and they don't go to school and they don't write exams, they will drop out. So that is for that. And then also teenage pregnancy for female. Some of them, sometimes because of adolescents, they will get pregnant and then they will drop out of school. And also, you will also look at also the factor of early marriages. Some of them, even though in the girl child is also suffering some level of discrimination in some communities in Africa, in some societies in Africa, where parents fear that the male child should be prioritized in terms of access to education. So once they get to the level of maturity, they are given into marriages. So that also contributes to out of school percentage. And you also look at the issue of conflict, displacements. Look at issues of war. So you have these situations in Sudan, you have Cameroon, you have Nigeria, you have Boko Haram, you have headers, attacks on farming communities, and the impact of that on the out of school children. So you have all these factors culminating, and several others culminating into reasons why we have this number of out of school children. And again, you also have to look at the educational policies and legislation, both direct and indirect cost implication of schools, of education. If we have a legislation that says primary education is free, secondary education is free, but in between that pronouncement and the reality, you will discover that there would have been some levies that are charged, for these children. And because those levies sometimes will be even more than the school fees, the tuition that they would have paid.
Exactly.
So that also accounts for the reasons why we experience this out of school percentage. And again, the kind of quality of the learning facilities that we have, like the classrooms, like the higher percentage of teacher to students ratio. Sometimes classes are overcrowded and they are so inconveniencing. So sometimes some of the children will just decide to stay at home than going to school. So these are several other factors.
The factors, there are so many, and they're there. I would like us to look at the impact of these factors. Nigeria is one of the countries with, they say Nigeria is one of the countries with the sharpest educational, inequalities. Girls receive far less than boys. Northerners receive far less than Southerners, and then Muslims receive far less than the Christians. So in the overall, what is the impact now on us as a nation?
You will see that we are in a competitive global environment. So if Africa does not train her children to be able to compete globally with other continents, then you can easily look at the impact of that on the future of the African economy, on the future of the African literacy level, science and technology, and the rest. Back to Nigeria. If you look at the Nigerian population that we have, if we are able to educate this population will now be a blessing in disguise. But if we don't educate this population, it will be a burden on the economy. So if you educate this population and you give it knowledge, literacy, both in science and technology, and you have vocation and technical education for all these children, they will go into production. You have a lot of factories producing our daily needs, and we are also consuming those materials that will be produced. And that means that this population will also fund our economy. So instead of importation, we will have a population that will produce and also consume. So even within, internally, we would have had a very robust economy because we are producing and consuming before we can also talk of exportation. So if we don't educate this population, if we don't take care of these out of school children, if we don't educate the African child, then it means we are sitting on a time bomb. Because by the time we lack basic needs of life that we cannot produce, that we cannot fund the economy, then it means there will be protests. It means the government will have it tough with the population. So it has a lot of impact on the Nigerian economy and the African economy.
There are a lot of other containing factors too. For example, monies that are supposed to be used for educational development are used to buy weapons in our country, for instance, to fight criminality, to fight terrorism. What do you recommend for nations like Nigeria to do to solve the challenge of inequality in education?
It's a very simple thing, by UNESCO standards. Every country, every member country of African Union will reduce it now to the Day of African Child. So
Okay.
every member is supposed to key in, and every country is supposed to key in. So if the theme of this year is anything to talk about in reality, then we must go back to fund the educational sector. The normal UNESCO standard is 20% of the budget should go into education. So whether it is the country's budget, whether it is the state budget, and then apart from that, there are some other percentages that will go into education that are established. But you discover that sometimes part of what even goes into the educational sector is not even up to 10%. Sometimes it's about 7%, 8%, 6%. So we must fund the educational sector. It does not mean that we cannot take care of other things, but the central budget, 20% of it. So you can now redistribute whatever is left to other sectors that you can even do, take care of security, take care of energy, and infrastructure.
A situation where you discover that some states don't even have education policies. How is this going to play in?
Well, some states. I don't know if Benue State has even one, because I don't know. I've never come across anyone. That's the simple truth. We need to deliberately look at the education sector with priority. For instance, we are ravaged by herdsmen attacks. People are sacked out of their ancestral homes. You have out of school children from these communities that are attacked, and people are displaced. Some you even have fondling, and people without unknown parentage. Then what is our policy? What is our education policy for these children? Do we have any? What is the kind of education that is being provided for these children in the camps? Do we have temporary primary schools or secondary schools in the camps or around the communities where these camps are established? These are issues that should be part of the policy, the overall policy that we will have as a state. And what is our policy about children that domestic violence, child abuse? What is our policy against child abuse that will, in the long run, support education for the girl child and for the vulnerable? Do we have a policy about the kind of infrastructure that we have in our primary schools and secondary schools and even tertiary institutions? How about the disabilities? Do we have provision for their access to the classroom? How do we design our classrooms? So if we design our classrooms where people who are disabled cannot have access to these classes, then it means we're discriminating against them. So they will not have education. So they should be able to have access without any assistance from anybody. So if we are talking about educational policy, it will also encompass all those things. And I was discussing with I was discussing with the executive chairman of State Universal Basic Education Board in Benue State, and she was telling me how she has proposed that the kind of infrastructure that will be built for Benue State primary schools in this dispensation will have a first lift, will be high-rise in buildings. And I said, okay, that's fine, but we should also think beyond that. For instance, if you go to communities where you have these high-rising buildings, you build these classrooms, very good architectural designs, but you don't have quality teachers. You don't even have the number of teachers that you should have to take care of teacher-students ratio. Then it means you are just building the structures for nobody. And I have always said, you see, we are in a crisis situation in the educational sector. So if we have a policy that will make these children have access to education, then we should also look at the kind of quality of teachers that we're going to recruit. You go to primary schools now, sometimes you have 2 teachers teaching from primary 1 to primary 6. But I was discussing with somebody and I said, see, we can adopt a system where we'll have volunteers, because most of these nursery schools that are having these teachers to teach in their nursery schools and private secondary schools are from the communities. So there is no community you go that you don't have a graduate. There is no community you go that you don't have an NC holder. So if you go back to the basics and you say, okay, let us have volunteers. So we establish a scheme. Whatever the private nursery schools are paying the teachers, or the private secondary schools are paying the teachers, then the government also gives something higher than that. So you will have these teachers not leaving their communities to go and teach somewhere else. So you would have solved the problem of accommodation, you would have solved the problem of transportation. So you get these volunteers from their communities to volunteer to teach, but you are paying them something higher than what the private sector is paying in the primary schools and secondary schools. In that way, what happens is you have good number of teachers in your schools, primary schools and secondary schools, and the wage bill will be less pending when you do formal recruitment, you do formal employment. But like I said, we need state of emergency in the educational system in Benue State, particularly, to take care of shortage of teachers. So that is my model that I will suggest.
Okay.
So if that is also embedded in the policy document, it's just a proposal.
You're watching the Anchor on Benue Television, and our guest now is Dr. Elijah Bano. He's of the History Department, Benue State University, Makudi. And we are talking around the Day of the African Child that was recently celebrated around the world. We're trying to look at a few things around this topic and why children's rights in Africa is so important. I understand one of the aims of celebrating this event is to also try to control the issue of female genital mutilation among the African girl children. Do you see the continent improving in this aspect too, of trying to control this imbalance?
Yeah, when I talked about, it's also part of what I was talking about, gender-based discrimination. So the issue of female circumcision was an issue in some societies. Even in Nigeria, we had some societies where that happened and came with some kind of discriminations. I hardly hear about that. And so the issue of discriminating against female child in schools is no longer there, that very much to be discussed, so and it also has to do with legislation.
Okay.
So if we are celebrating this year's Day of African Child and the theme is on education for all the children in Africa, the time is now, then we would have also gone back to reflect on the kind of legislations that we had in protecting the girl child too. And that also takes care of that, and would have also looked at other aspects of the legislation. Like I mentioned, the issue of teenage pregnancy, forceful marriage, which is early marriage, that affects these female children. The issue of hygiene, sanitation and hygiene, provision and supply of sanitary pads. All these, if we look at them, then would have solved the problem of, the girl child and access to education. I think what we need to do as a continent, as a country, and as a state, is to deliberately make the education of the African child, the Nigerian child, the Benue child a priority, because we are having a huge population, and as the estimates show, in the next by 2050, we are going to have about 1 billion of African children. That population is alarming, so we need to begin to look at how those that we have now will get quality education, both at the primary, secondary, and tertiary level. And we should, in the real sense of it, make primary education, basic education, accessible and free. Both, we should do away with direct and indirect costing of the education process for the African child, for Nigerian child, and for Benue child. And we have to be deliberate about it. And we also need to have an educational policy that will guide our implementation in trying to ensure that we reduce and we do away with out-of-school children.
Dr. Elijah Tedo Ikpane of Benue State University, History Department to be precise. Thank you very much for having this moment with us on the anchor.
Thank you, Teve, for inviting me. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
This is where we end. We'll be back next week. Do join us again. I am Teve Agapi.